You are listening to Sales Optex. Visit us at salesoptex.com.
You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision. It's almost like engineering, right? You fall off your bike, you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line right across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen.
Right, it's completely binary.
Exactly, it's broken. And the path forward is just obvious. You put a cast on it, you wait 6 weeks, and you're done.
And we find a strange comfort in that visibility. You know, when a problem is neatly categorized and, well, physically apparent, the human brain feels a sense of control over the solution.
Yeah, but then you step into the world of organizational dynamics or workplace psychology, or honestly just trying to figure out why your team seems completely demoralized on a Tuesday morning and that X-ray machine is just completely useless. You're suddenly operating in this diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. There are no clean lines.
It is the absolute definition of muddy waters. Because when you evaluate the health of a complex organization, or even your own cognitive state, after, I don't know, 2 years of nonstop corporate restructuring, you're dealing with layered, invisible variables.
Right.
You might have dropping productivity or high turnover, but those are trailing indicators. They're the symptoms, not the disease.
And the disease itself seems to be literally everywhere right now. I mean, let's look at what's actually happening on the ground, because there is this massive shift occurring in how people respond to their work environments. For this deep dive, we've pulled together an incredibly diverse stack of sources to really unpack this.
We're looking at academic studies on hospital nurses, specifically the Brown study, along with research from the Center for Creative Leadership, insights from Scaled Agile, Soren Kaplan's change fatigue model, and some really fascinating public sector data from NC peers.
Yeah, and our mission here today for you, listening right now, is to equip you with a deep understanding of why continuous organizational change drains our mental reserves and how to practically build a resilient mindset for yourself and your team.
Because understanding the why behind all this fatigue is really the first step to reclaiming your agency in a chaotic work environment.
Definitely. So let's just jump right in. We have this data from the Center for Creative Leadership. They're drawing on Gartner research, and it maps out employee willingness to support organizational change. So in 2016, roughly 74% of the workforce was essentially on board. They were willing to adapt to new workflows, new software, new leadership.
Which is a remarkably healthy baseline, honestly. It suggests a culture where the majority of employees trust the direction of the organization and, well, they have the mental bandwidth to absorb new information.
But then we look at 2022. That willingness number plummets from 74% down to 43%.
Yeah.
I mean, that isn't just a dip. That is a structural collapse. In 6 years, we went from 3/4 of the workforce being open to change to less than half.
It's staggering.
If you're rolling out a new initiative today, you are starting with a majority of your workforce fundamentally unwilling to support it.
The implications of that 43% are just severe. It basically means the default setting of the modern workforce has shifted from cautious optimism to exhaustion. We are looking at a phenomenon that researchers define as change fatigue.
Change fatigue.
Yeah, and it's really critical to understand that this isn't just some colloquial term for being tired at the end of a long week. Clinically, in organizational psychology, change fatigue is a very distinct state of exhaustion resulting from continuous, rapid, or overwhelming shifts in the environment.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because it sounds like the difference between running a sprint and being told to run a marathon where the finish line just keeps moving. At a certain point, the muscles just give out.
That's a great way to look at it.
But what I find really fascinating and honestly a bit insidious is how this actually manifests. Because managers are usually trained to look for pushback, right? They announce a new reporting structure and they fully expect someone to raise their hand and say, this is a terrible idea and here is why.
Right. They are looking for active resistance. And historically, that is what organizational literature always focused on. Change resistance is intentional. It's a visible conflict.
Like an argument in a meeting.
Exactly. It's an employee actively sabotaging a new workflow, or a union filing a grievance, or even just a heated debate in a town hall.
Which, ironically, is kind of healthy, isn't it? If someone is fighting you on a new software rollout, they at least care enough about their job to argue about it. Like, they have the energy to fight.
That is such a crucial insight. Active resistance requires a massive expenditure of cognitive and emotional energy. It means the employee is still engaged with the future of the company, even if they completely disagree with the current strategy. Change fatigue, on the other hand, is entirely passive. Yes, it is characterized by apathy, disengagement, and passive resignation.
Passive resignation. Wow. That is the silent killer here. It's the difference between actively fighting a current, which is resistance, versus just letting yourself drown because you're too exhausted to tread water anymore, which is fatigue.
That's exactly what's happening.
But if it's invisible, how do we spot it before the team just goes under? If I'm a manager, how do I know my team isn't just being agreeable, but actually drowning?
Well, because it is passive,
Hmm?
leadership often completely misses it. They roll out a massive new initiative, they hold the training sessions, and nobody argues. There's no visible resistance. So the executives pat themselves on the back for a smooth rollout, assuming silence equals agreement.
Oh, that's dangerous.
It's incredibly dangerous because in reality, the silence is a symptom of cognitive overload. The employees literally do not have the mental bandwidth to process the change, let alone formulate a coherent argument against it. To spot it, you really have to look for withdrawal behaviors.
Withdrawal behaviors. Like what?
Soren Kaplan's models on change fatigue highlight several indirect symptoms. You'll see an inability to make basic decisions. Tasks that used to take 5 minutes suddenly require a committee meeting because no one wants to take responsibility.
Oh, man.
You'll also see higher absenteeism. And we're not talking about people calling in sick because they have the flu. They call in sick because they physically cannot face another day of shifting goalposts.
It's like a kind of mental truant behavior.
Yes, exactly. You also see a deep, quiet skepticism toward leadership and ultimately a slow bleed of productivity. The team is physically present. They are nodding in all the Zoom meetings, but the output just drops.
This completely shifts the entire paradigm of how we should view failed corporate projects. I mean, the Center for Creative Leadership notes that somewhere between 50 to 70% of planned change efforts fail.
It's a huge number.
If an airline had a 50 to 70% failure rate, we would ground every single plane on the planet. But in the corporate world, a multi-million-dollar software implementation fails, and everyone just shrugs and blames the vendor or the timeline.
They blame the structural elements because they're viewing the organization through the lens of traditional change management. And traditional change management is highly reactive and project-focused. It treats a transformation like, say, moving to a new cloud infrastructure as a discrete event with a start date and an end date.
Right. It's all Gantt charts and implementation milestones.
Exactly. It manages the logistics to change, but it entirely ignores the human capacity required to actually absorb that change. And this is where we run into the concept of change saturation.
Change saturation. And we have some very concrete data on what that saturation looks like from the public sector, right?
We do. NCPERS, which monitors public retirement systems, they looked at major infrastructure overhauls. They found that typical large-scale projects, like implementing a new pension administration system, take on average 44% longer than initially projected.
Which means a 3-year project stretches to almost 4.5 years.
Exactly. But the critical failure here isn't just the delay itself. It's the assumption that the organization is operating in a vacuum while they wait for this project to finish.
Right, because life goes on.
Exactly. During that 4.5-year period, the employees still have to process daily pension claims. Furthermore, there will be legislative changes altering how those claims are processed. Team members will retire and need to be replaced. Budgets will fluctuate.
So you have the baseline chaos of just running the business, and on top of that, you have this massive, delayed, looming structural change casting a shadow over everything.
That is change saturation. The volume of simultaneous disruption simply exceeds the organization's capacity to adapt.
Yeah.
We're treating human beings like servers.
Right. If you expect a computer to update its software, it just does it. You push a patch over the weekend, the system reboots, and it's done.
But human cognition doesn't work like that.
Yep.
You can't just reboot a person.
No, you really can't. Which brings up an incredibly helpful way to visualize this cognitive capacity. The research from CCL frames human resilience like a bank account.
It's a brilliant analogy.
Every team member has a finite reserve of energy, attention, and emotional capital. And every single change the workplace introduces is a withdrawal from that account.
And it is vital to note that this applies to positive changes as well.
Wait, really? Even good changes?
Even good ones. Even if the organization is rolling out a fantastic new benefit or moving to a much nicer office building, that transition requires the brain to break old habits and build new neural pathways. It requires learning. And learning is metabolically and cognitively expensive. So it is still a withdrawal.
Okay, let's ground this for the listener. Say you're a regular team member. On Monday, leadership announces a pivot in the quarterly strategy. That's a massive withdrawal.
Huge withdrawal.
Then on Tuesday, IT forces a migration to a new two-factor authentication system. Small withdrawal, but still a withdrawal. Wednesday, your department gets reorganized, so you have to figure out the communication style of a brand new manager. Another withdrawal.
And all the while, you still have your actual job responsibilities.
Right, you still have to hit your daily targets. If the company just keeps making these withdrawals without ever making a deposit, your account hits zero. You go bankrupt.
And a bankrupt account is the clinical manifestation of change fatigue. You simply cannot ask a bankrupt employee to invest in a new vision, but then the question becomes, what actually constitutes a deposit?
Because a lot of organizations think a deposit is like a free pizza on Friday or a generic wellness email from HR.
Which usually just feels insulting when you're working a 60-hour week trying to learn 3 new software platforms.
Yeah, it really does.
Because those aren't real deposits. A cognitive deposit is dedicated time to achieve mastery over a new skill so it stops draining your energy. A deposit is the active removal of an obsolete, redundant task from an employee's plate to free up their schedule. Is psychological safety.
So it's reducing the burden, not just offering a superficial perk.
Exactly. Scaled Agile uses a similar framework, but they look at it through the lens of physical training. They suggest that the capacity for change is like a muscle.
Okay, I like that.
The muscle framework is highly effective because it acknowledges that adaptation can be trained. If you expose a muscle to progressive resistance, small, manageable changes with adequate rest, the muscle undergoes hypertrophy. It gets stronger. An organization can actually build its capacity to change by practicing small, iterative adaptations.
But if you go to the gym and lift your maximum weight for 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, you don't get stronger. You get rhabdomyolysis. The muscle fiber literally breaks down, floods your bloodstream with toxins, and your kidneys fail.
That is the exact organizational equivalent of change saturation. Continuous, relentless stimulation without a recovery period leads to catastrophic failure. It paralyzes the organization because the change muscle is fundamentally torn.
And this completely shifts the blame from the employee to the system. The failure of traditional management is that they keep demanding peak athletic performance without ever scheduling a rest day. It's the cumulative cost. People aren't breaking because of one specific software update. They are breaking because of the 1,000 micro changes that preceded it over the last 3 years.
Yes. This is why organizations absolutely need to transition from change management to organizational resilience. Change management asks, how do we get this one project implemented? Organizational resilience asks, how do we build a systemic capacity to endure continuous disruption over the next decade? It is a proactive global approach rather than a reactive, localized one.
I want to pivot here because to really see the mechanics of how this cumulative cost breaks people down, and more importantly, how some people manage to survive it, we need to look outside the standard corporate office. We need to look at an environment where change is constant, the stakes are literal life and death, and the baseline stress is already at maximum capacity.
We're talking about healthcare.
Exactly. Specifically, this fascinating study by Dr. Robin J. Brown on hospital staff nurses.
The hospital floor is really the ultimate crucible for organizational change. You have administrative mandates, shifting insurance protocols, massive technological implementations like electronic health records, and all of it is layered on top of the intense emotional labor of patient care.
And according to the Brown study, this constant change in healthcare is actually severely under-researched regarding its impact on the nurses themselves.
Which is surprising given how vital they are to the system.
Right. So the Brown study looked at 535 staff nurses across both rural and urban hospitals, trying to map the relationship between change fatigue, their level of resilience, and their overall job satisfaction. And to ground this, the researchers utilized a very specific psychological framework, the transactional model of stress and coping, which Lazarus and Folkman developed back in 1984.
The Lazarus and Folkman model is so foundational because it completely reframes how we view stress. Prior to this, stress was often viewed as a simple stimulus response mechanism. A bad thing happens and you feel stressed.
Like a reflex.
Right. But the transactional model argues that stress is an ongoing interaction, a transaction between the individual and their environment.
So how did that actually play out in real time, like on the hospital floor?
It hinges on 2 stages of appraisal. When a stressor is introduced, say, hospital administration announces a complete overhaul of the patient charting system, the brain performs a primary appraisal. It asks, is this a threat to me?
Right.
If the answer is yes, it immediately moves to secondary appraisal, which asks, Do I have the resources and coping mechanisms to handle this threat?
Ah, I see. So if a massive new project lands on my desk and my cognitive bank account is full and I have a supportive manager, my secondary appraisal says I can handle this. It's a challenge, not a crisis.
Exactly.
But if my bank account is empty, my secondary appraisal triggers a massive stress response.
Correct. The stress doesn't live in the charting system itself. The stress lives in the gap between the demands of the environment and the resources of the individual. And the Brown study applied this directly to hospital nurses, viewing organizational change as the chronic environmental stressor.
And the data they pulled out of these 535 nurses revealed some incredible patterns. First off, there was a direct correlation with the size of the facility. As the bed count and the sheer size of the hospital increased, change fatigue increased.
Which aligns perfectly with the saturation model we just talked about. A massive urban hospital has more layers of bureaucracy, more specialized departments, and more complex reporting matrices. When leadership at the top of that hierarchy initiates a change, it cascades down through multiple layers, often becoming much more convoluted and burdensome by the time it reaches the floor nurses.
But then they found this really interesting reverse correlation with education. As the educational level of the nurse increased, their change fatigue actually decreased.
Yeah, that's a fascinating data point.
My initial thought was, well, maybe nurses with higher degrees get promoted off the floor and into administration, so they are the ones inflicting the change rather than receiving it.
That is a very logical assumption, but it's actually deeper than that. Higher education often equips individuals with broader cognitive frameworks to contextualize the why behind systemic changes.
Oh, I see.
When you understand the macroeconomic factors or the broad healthcare policy that is driving a new protocol, it feels less arbitrary. It reduces the cognitive dissonance, which in turn reduces the fatigue.
That makes total sense. It's the difference between someone randomly tearing up your garden versus understanding they're digging a trench to fix a gas leak that could blow up your house. The context changes the appraisal.
Exactly.
But I want to get to the most compelling data point in the entire Brown study, which was the paradox between novice nurses and experienced veterans.
This finding is absolutely central to understanding human resilience. The data showed that experienced nurses, those who had been in the field for years, demonstrated significantly higher levels of change fatigue than the novice nurses who were fresh out of school.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that flies in the face of conventional wisdom. You would assume that a veteran who has survived 20 years of hospital administration would be completely bulletproof. You'd think experience creates this Teflon coating where new changes just slide right off. But the data says the veterans are actually far more exhausted by the next mandate.
Because experience isn't Teflon, it's an accumulation of weight. We go back to the cumulative cost.
Right, the bank account again.
The novice nurse comes onto the floor with a full bank account. They haven't endured the implementation of 3 different electronic health record systems in the last decade. The veteran has. The veteran is carrying the scar tissue of every failed initiative, every broken promise from management, and every redundant workflow they've ever had to navigate.
Their change muscle is permanently inflamed. So when management announces yet another new protocol, the novice says, okay, let's learn this. The veteran says, I literally do not have the capacity for this again.
But here's the paradox. Those same experienced nurses, despite having much higher change fatigue, simultaneously showed significantly higher levels of personal resilience and higher overall job satisfaction than the novices.
That is the piece that requires serious unpacking. How can you be profoundly exhausted by your organization, but still highly satisfied with your job and deeply resilient? Does resilience just mean learning how to suffer better?
It means they have learned to separate the administrative environment from the intrinsic value of their work. They have developed powerful internal psychological buffers over those decades. The novice gets hit with a frustrating new charting rule, and because they lack that internal armor, it destroys their love for nursing. Their job satisfaction crashes.
Oh, wow. But the veteran gets hit with the same rule, and they're exhausted by it, sure, but their armor protects their core identity. They know how to draw deep satisfaction from the actual patient care, despite the administrative noise.
Exactly. They have cultivated a localized resilience. They cannot control the influx of corporate mandates, but they have absolute control over their internal appraisal of the work itself.
This is a massive revelation. It proves that while we might not be able to stop the corporate office from raining down new initiatives, we can build internal architecture to survive the storm.
We can build our own umbrella, in a sense.
Yeah. But it also raises a really urgent question. If that experienced nurse built their armor through 20 years of trial by fire, do the rest of us have to suffer for 2 decades to figure it out? Can we artificially manufacture that resilience for everyone else?
Yes, we actually can. The psychological architecture of resilience can be engineered and taught. And that brings us to the research on PsyCap, positive psychological capital.
Right, we have a highly targeted study here that took this exact challenge head on. They designed an intervention for nurses working in a long-term care hospital. And we really need to frame how intense that specific environment is for the listener.
A long-term care facility is essentially a baseline environment of chronic distress. You are dealing with geriatric rehabilitation, degenerative diseases, and end-of-life care. The staff are perpetually exposed to patient mortality.
It's heavy.
The emotional labor is astronomical, and the risk for compassion fatigue is arguably higher than anywhere else in the healthcare sector.
If you can teach resilience in an environment where patients are constantly declining, you can teach it anywhere.
The researchers didn't just throw together a motivational seminar either. They utilized a deeply structured instructional design model known as the ADDI process.
ADDI. That stands for Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation, right?
Yeah.
Walk us through how AD actually functions in a psychological intervention like this. It sounds more like software development than therapy.
It's very similar, actually. It ensures the intervention is evidence-based rather than instinct-driven. In the analysis phase, they didn't just assume the nurses were tired. They analyzed the specific environmental stressors and baseline psychological capital of the staff. They identified exactly where the cognitive deficits were.
And once they mapped those deficits, they moved to design and development.
Right. It was on a 10-session program delivered over 5 weeks. And the entire curriculum was rigorously developed to target and build the 4 core pillars of positive psychological capital,
which form the acronym HERO: Hope, Efficacy, Resilience, and Optimism. Now, these words get thrown around in corporate mission statements a lot, usually as vague platitudes. But in psychological capital, these are highly specific, measurable traits. Let's break down how they actually trained each one of these pillars during those 5 weeks. Let's start with hope.
In a clinical context, hope is not just wishing for a good outcome. It is a cognitive construct consisting of 2 things: agency, which is the willpower to move toward a goal, and pathways, the ability to generate alternative routes when obstacles appear.
So it's very active.
Very active. To build this, the very first session involved participants creating new identity badges. They didn't just write their names, they had to assign themselves positive nicknames based on their perceived strengths.
Which seems like, I don't know, a small icebreaker, but language fundamentally shapes our reality. If you force someone to publicly claim an identity of capability, you are laying the groundwork for agency.
Precisely. And they followed this up in later sessions with strength cards. To build efficacy, which is the deep-seated belief in your own competence to execute a task, they had the nurses identify their core personal strengths and then share highly specific historical success stories based on those traits.
They are forcing the brain to mine the past for evidence of success, rather than ruminating on evidence of failure. If I'm a nurse and I have to stand up and tell a story about a time my quick thinking saved a patient's life, I am literally reinforcing the neural pathway of self-efficacy.
And that prepares them for what is arguably the most difficult trait to train in an end-of-life ward: optimism. Optimism in PsyCap isn't toxic positivity, it is an explanatory style.
What do you mean by explanatory style?
It is how you explain the causes of negative events to yourself. Do you view a failure as permanent and pervasive, or do you view it as temporary and specific?
Got it. To change that explanatory style, the researchers used a cognitive behavioral technique called the ABCDE method.
The ABCDE method, adversity, belief, consequence, disputation, and energization, is a profound tool for cognitive reframing. They had the nurses document negative events from their shifts. Then they systematically trained them to identify their automatic negative beliefs about those events and forcefully dispute those catastrophic thoughts with evidence.
So let's play this out. Adversity. A patient refuses to take their medication. Belief. I'm a terrible nurse and I can't control my patients. Consequence, I feel totally burned out. Disputation. Wait, the patient's refusal is a symptom of their dementia, not a reflection of my clinical skill.
Yes. And that disputation leads directly to energization. You rechannel the emotional response away from self-blame and toward problem-solving. Over 5 weeks, they stacked these exercises. They added music meditation at the end of every session to physically down-regulate the nervous system. They used reminiscence training. They aggressively funded the nurses' cognitive bank accounts.
And the evaluation phase of the ADDI model showed some staggering results. They used a control group, nurses who didn't take the training to ensure the data was rock solid. The experimental group showed statistically significant spikes across the board. Hope, optimism, self-efficacy, and resilience all skyrocketed.
And the downstream effects were exactly what we would hope for. Total burnout plummeted. Organizational commitment, their loyalty to the hospital and the team increased significantly. But the most vital metric was a dramatic increase in what the literature calls compassion satisfaction.
Let's define compassion satisfaction because it feels like the ultimate antidote to change fatigue.
Compassion satisfaction is the intrinsic pleasure and deep meaning derived from the act of doing your work well. It is the joy of helping others. The hero training didn't just make the nurses less exhausted, it reconnected them to the fundamental purpose of why they became nurses in the first place.
It reawakened the core mission. But as we look at this data, there is one metric that stands out because it didn't change at all: secondary traumatic stress, or STS. The levels of STS remained basically identical between the group that take the 5-week training and the control group that didn't.
And that is the most intellectually honest finding of the entire study.
Why didn't secondary traumatic stress go down? It's like we upgraded the car's engine, resilience and hope, and we improved the fuel efficiency so burnout dropped. But we didn't change the fact that the car is still driving through a war zone. The trauma is still there.
The war zone is a reality of the long-term care facility. A psychological intervention cannot alter the physical reality of a terminal patient's decline. It cannot stop the grief of a family. Secondary traumatic stress is the environmental reality of the road they are driving on. You cannot meditate away mortality.
So the trauma is a constant.
The stressor is constant. But the HERO framework proves that while you cannot change the environment, you can entirely rewrite how the individual processes that environment. Before the training, the environmental stress was converting directly into chronic burnout and apathy. After the training, the nurses were able to process that exact same environmental trauma and convert their response into compassion satisfaction. They changed the internal appraisal.
Which provides an incredible blueprint for you, the listener. Your environment might be chaotic. You might be dealing with endless software migrations, contradictory mandates from corporate, and impossible deadlines. You cannot stop those external stressors, but you can intentionally cultivate your hemo traits. You can practice the ABCDE method to dispute the catastrophic belief that your career is falling apart just because a project failed. You can build your own armor.
You can seize agency over your own psychological capital.
I find that incredibly validating. However, if we stop the conversation right here, I think we are committing a massive error.
How so?
Because if the takeaway is just, hey, the corporation is going to keep bankrupting your cognitive account, so is your personal responsibility to go meditate and be more resilient, that is borderline victim blaming. It lets terrible leadership completely off the hook.
I completely agree. Relying exclusively on personal resilience to survive a toxic organizational structure is a massive failure of leadership. It is treating the symptoms of the frontline workers while ignoring the pathology of the executive suite.
Yes. We have to zoom out from the individual nurse or the individual team member and look at the organizational architecture. We need to talk about organizational alchemy, how leaders can actually stop inflicting the damage in the first place and start transforming a culture of fatigue into a culture of energy.
To do that, we look at the structural frameworks provided by Scaled Agile and Soren Kaplan. Scaled Agile is quite uncompromising on this point. They argue that if an organization wants to introduce a new initiative, leadership must forcibly descale daily operations.
Let's break down descaling, because in most corporate environments, addition never comes with subtraction.
And that is the root of the saturation problem. Descaling means acknowledging that capacity is finite. If the executive team decides that implementing a new workflow is a critical priority for Q3, they cannot simply drop it onto the existing workload. They must structurally deprioritize or pause other running work to create the bandwidth.
Going back to the bank account, you cannot authorize a massive withdrawal unless you have audited the account and freed up the funds. If you don't cancel an existing subscription, the new charge bounces.
Exactly. Leadership has to make the hard choices about what not to do. Furthermore, Scaled Agile introduces a cultural mandate. Invite, don't inflict.
Invite, don't inflict. The wording there implies a major shift in power dynamics.
It does. When a change is designed in a closed boardroom and inflicted top-down upon the workforce, the employees are positioned as victims of the change. It strips them of agency, which, as we learned from PsyCap, destroys hope.
Right, because they have no willpower or pathways.
Exactly. But when leadership invites the workforce to co-create the transformation, when they ask the end users how the new software should actually be configured to help their daily workflow, they generate ownership.
Soren Kaplan's change fatigue model echoes this heavily. He argues that leaders have to constantly assess the pace and volume of change. They have to prioritize transparency and set realistic expectations. Why are we doing this? What is the actual business case? If you can't explain the why clearly, you have no business asking people to endure the how.
And this requires dismantling a very persistent corporate myth. If you look at the literature on change fatigue, and Nick Morgan's work is a great reference point here, you'll see this on Wikipedia too. They talk about the danger of the heroic leader.
The heroic leader, like the singular visionary genius who drags the reluctant masses into the future through sheer force of personality and demanding 80-hour work weeks.
That archetype is heavily romanticized in business culture. But from an organizational health perspective, it is a disaster. A heroic leader relies on pushing the organization past its sustainable limits. It works for a short sprint, sure, but it guarantees long-term change fatigue.
Because it's entirely dependent on one person's energy.
Right. Sustainable change doesn't require a single charismatic savior. It requires distributed, capable teams.
But to build those distributed teams, the Center for Creative Leadership emphasizes one non-negotiable prerequisite: psychological safety.
Psychological safety is the bedrock of resilience. If a company wants to know if they are suffering from change fatigue before the productivity numbers crash and people start quitting, they need an early warning system. That system only functions if employees feel completely safe raising their hand and saying, "My bank account is overdrawn. I cannot take on this new project without dropping one of my core duties."
But in most cultures, saying that gets you labeled as not a team player or someone who can't handle the fast-paced environment. So people stay silent, they nod in the meeting, and then they secretly burn out.
If the culture punishes honesty about capacity, the organization will fly blind right into a wall of change saturation. But when psychological safety is paired with descaling and the hero traits, the CCL research shows that an organization can actually transition from change fatigue to change energy.
Change energy. Honestly, that sounds a bit like utopian corporate speak. Can an organization actually be energized by continuous disruption?
It happens when recalibrating expectations allows innovation to stop feeling like a burden and start feeling like a learning culture. When employees have the bandwidth to learn, the agency to co-create, and the safety to fail, the change muscle becomes highly developed. They lean into adaptation.
So what does this all mean for the listener who isn't the CEO? I mean, this all sounds incredible if you can dictate the culture, but if I'm a middle manager, I don't control the scale. I can't stop the corporate office from rolling out 3 new software systems. How do I descale when I don't control the volume?
The middle manager is in arguably the most difficult position in the modern corporate structure. They are the shock absorbers. They catch the pressure from the top and they catch the fatigue from the bottom. But they do have agency. They cannot stop the rain from falling from the executive level, but they can hold the umbrella for their team.
I love that visual. I want to know exactly how to hold the umbrella. What are the practical steps for a manager to protect their team's cognitive bank accounts?
First, you establish a microculture of psychological safety. The broader company culture might be highly toxic and reactive, but your specific team meetings, your one-on-ones, can be a sanctuary. You explicitly give your team permission to tell you when they are drowning without fear of punishment.
You act as the firewall between them and the corporate toxicity.
Second, you actively translate ambiguous messaging. Scaled Agile points out that leadership often fails to speak with one voice. A team might get contradictory mandates from different departments. Navigating that contradiction requires massive cognitive load from the employee.
Right, trying to figure out who to listen to.
Exactly. As the manager holding the umbrella, you intercept that noise. You clarify the priorities, resolve the contradictions, and give your team a single actionable directive.
So you are taking on the cognitive load of processing the corporate chaos so your team can save their energy for actual execution.
Yes. And third, you practice ruthless prioritization of the domain you do control. You might be forced to implement the new corporate software, but you have the authority to cancel the weekly, hour-long status meeting that could just be an email.
Right.
You can extend the deadline on an internal departmental report, you actively audit your team's bank accounts, and you intentionally cancel minor internal withdrawals to free up the capacity they need to survive the major corporate mandates.
You triage their capacity, you protect the asset. This is a profound shift in how we think about management. It's not about driving productivity, it's about safeguarding capacity.
It's the only sustainable way forward.
Let's pull all of these threads together because we've covered a lot of ground today. We started by redefining the problem. Change fatigue is not active rebellion. It is the silent, passive resignation of an overdrawn workforce, which is evidenced by that massive drop in employee willingness to adapt over the last few years.
And we saw how traditional change management completely fails to solve this, because it treats humans like digital infrastructure. It causes change saturation by continually withdrawing from the cognitive bank account without ever authorizing a deposit, which tears the organizational change muscle.
But we also found a powerful roadmap in the most stressful environments. The healthcare data proved that while experience brings the scar tissue of fatigue, it can also forge profound internal resilience. And through the ADDD process and PsyCap interventions, we know we can actively engineer that resilience. We can train our teams in the hero traits: hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism, shifting our internal appraisal so we can find compassion satisfaction even in a war zone.
Finally, we established that personal resilience must be matched by structural empathy. Leadership must descale operations, invite co-creation, and foster psychological safety, while middle managers must fiercely hold the umbrella, translating chaos into clarity and ruthlessly prioritizing capacity.
It really is a comprehensive survival guide for the modern workplace. But before we wrap up this deep dive, we always like to leave you with a final thought, a synthesis of everything we've uncovered that might challenge how you operate tomorrow.
Throughout the analysis of these academic studies, the failure rates, the psychological models, there is one invisible variable that dictates absolutely everything, yet corporate culture treats it as an enemy. That variable is time.
Time.
Yes, we operate in a business culture that idolizes velocity. The fastest to market, the quickest to pivot, the most agile.
Speed is always treated as the ultimate metric of success.
But if change fatigue is fundamentally a crisis of pacing, if our muscles are tearing because they lack a recovery period, and our accounts are bankrupt because we never pause to earn deposits, then velocity is actually killing us.
So what's the alternative to velocity?
Perhaps the ultimate competitive advantage for the organizations of the next decade won't be their ability to innovate the fastest. Instead, the most successful, durable companies will be the ones that master the strategic art of pausing.
The strategic art of pausing. Wow.
Deliberately stopping. Intentionally halting the influx of new initiatives, not out of weakness, but as a calculated maneuver to let their people's cognitive muscles recover before the next sprint. Recognizing that a strategic pause is not wasted time. It is the mandatory deposit required to fund the next massive leap forward.
The idea that doing absolutely nothing could be the most aggressive, innovative strategy a company could deploy right now is incredible.
It requires immense leadership discipline to stop moving in a world obsessed with speed.
So, as you head into your next quarter or your next team meeting, take a hard look past the project timelines and the operational metrics. Look at the invisible reality of your team's energy. Are you managing a healthy, adaptable muscle, or are you withdrawing from an account that is already deep in the red?
Check your balance, and don't be afraid to authorize a pause. And if the rain doesn't stop, be ready to hold the umbrella.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.